Sure, that's probably.
We're gonna give it a chance for you guys to set up and part.
Yeah.
Thing you guys can come here.
So who would you talk to? Changes it.
I think David has it in Word format.
Okay.
Oh, you?
You can-
Okay.
Already start recording.
Ready, Adam, are you ready? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you call in?
Let's give this a try.
Okay.
David, do you want me to take the notes or or if you email me the Word version, I can do it. Whatever's easier for you.
Thanks, Adam.
Either way. Connection.
So bad. I was saying, you could have Mike. Do you want to sit here?
Either way, whatever.
Here, you can sit here and log in and pull up all your stuff, and I'll go get my laptop and sit over here, and then David can see better.
Okay.
Here, David.
Well, good morning, everybody. We will be ready in just a minute. We're just adjusting a few folks.
Okay.
You have issues, obviously.
Uh-huh.
Down there, meet everyone, so on and so forth. You can also lock.
Okay.
Right?
Got it.
Adam, if there, it seems like to me that only IT knows how to allow more people into the meeting. Like, you know, because you have to register and then be allowed in.
They're gonna pop up right here.
So does the chairman know how to do that?
Yep. He does, hopefully.
The biggest thing is if you go up top here, take it up, just making sure things get out of hand, you understand that you can mute everyone here.
Yeah.
You have your security settings here. So you can mute yourself, you can stop your video, you go up again. Hit this again, just stop sharing this.
Right.
Okay. But if you want a how-to on the entire announcement.
No, I feel fairly comfortable.
I just
That's
didn't know
what
what
you said.
I didn't know what the mechanism is to, I was imagining if I was the chair and somebody wanted in. Before it was easy, just hit the link and you're in, but then you have to register to be allowed in.
So they registered, and then the room here, the chair will just hit allow. And
Gotcha.
Yep.
So you
The
can,
rest of it's
you
automated.
can see them pop in.
Yep. The
Cool.
rest of it's automated. You just wait for the pop in.
Yeah. If anybody sees anybody that's waiting to admit and I'm not getting it, just kick me.
We're too far.
You have enough things to do already.
David, are you ready?
Just 1 second. Fine.
Okay, okay. You good? Hey Jennifer, how are you? Are you good over there?
Yes.
Perfect. No worries. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the May 10th Snow Day work session on the Aquifer Protection Overlay Zone. Thanks for joining with us this morning. Our intent is just to give David direction, and we probably won't spend a whole lot of time wordsmithing things so that we can move through this process pretty quickly. We have, hopefully you can see the Planning and Zoning Commission certified, says February 10th, 2021, amendment number ZA-02-19. Should appear on your screen. If it's not, please let me know. So as we work through, guys, we'll just go item by item and away we go. Here within the first group here, we have the Aquifer Protection Overlay Zone. Any suggestions, any big items?
I'd like to make one suggestion. Instead of one starting with that legislative finding, to maybe put a statement as far as a purpose of this, to state something like the purpose of the APOZ is to prevent degradation of water quality within the Casper Aquifer.
Okay.
And then two could be start with that approximately 50 feet or 50 to 60%.
Okay. So you want a purpose statement and then remove legislative finding.
Yeah.
Eve, anything on this page that we see so far through D? Okay. Okay.
So let me restate that. So just, now you didn't want to have the legislative findings in there?
No,
Or
I
just
do.
add a
Just that,
purpose
just
one?
that legislative findings can be eliminated.
So you put purpose and then
Yeah, the purpose, and then the
add,
paragraph 2 would start with approximately 50 to 60%.
okay, so the purpose would state something about keeping the groundwater clean, and then the next paragraph would be the legislative findings.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
Okay.
Well, I think that the purpose isn't, the primary purpose isn't to keep the water clean. The primary purpose of planning and zoning regs is to establish rules in the Casper Aquifer Protection Overlay Zone. The reasons are what they are.
Correct, but we're defining actually sort of under Aquifer Protection Overlay Zone. The purpose of the APOZ is this, to protect our quality of water. And then we go into these regulations that follow.
Well, the purpose is to establish planning and zoning regs in the APOZ, you know, or to define them.
So could you merge those two to set standards and regulations to protect the Aquifer Overlay Zone?
Sure.
Okay. Starting with Casper Aquifer on the bottom of page 1 there and working through to the top of page 2. Does anybody have anything for that?
Not till I'd like to insert another paragraph before number 2 there,
Okay,
David, before you start the definitions.
so right here.
Yeah, just something to the fact that the data since we had available to us in 1999 shows that the western boundary of the APOZ is inaccurate and warrants revision of the original boundary. And I can word that later, but something to that effect.
Okay. Keep anything down to the beginning of 2. Okay. All right, moving through 2 and Oh, goodness. Through two, and item double I there. Nothing from Sue, anything from you, Heber?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So we'll start at triple I, any pesticides, down to the bottom of F, under vulnerable feature. Anything in that?
Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
We maybe should ask Nancy Sindelar if she wants to redefine the definition of a person in item E.
Well, I'd love to enjoy, entertain it from the public.
That was a rhetorical comment.
Okay.
Businesses are people too. Any landowner is a person, not regardless of its tax status. It's a response to what she said the other day in our meeting.
Okay. Anything through F? To okay. Here we go. Is this working out for you, David, to do it this way?
Yep,
Okay.
I'm keeping up, I think, for a minute.
Okay.
And that's not a matter of opinion, it's a legal definition, well established. So I'm not asserting something that's my own opinion in item.
Okay. From G. Anything from G to the bottom of one here.
Yeah, under A, David.
Okay.
There is established within an incorporated area of Albany County, an aquifer protection overlay zone. The APOZ, and then I'd like to say something like the APOZ boundary is adopted from the 2008 City of Laramie Casper Aquifer Protection Plan. And something to the effect of the Technical Advisory Committee coming up with those boundary lines and all. And so that you would be eliminating, David, the rest of that statement starting, you'll have the APOZ boundary is adopted. So, yada, 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 and eliminate is delineated all the way through January 4th, 2011.
The challenge with that is that it's not true. The city's boundary isn't specific either. It's drawn on section lines. So this is actually an important point to make. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but the Technical Advisory Committee was the largest group of respected and, geologists assembled. And Mr. Hinckley didn't participate in that group. At the time, the entire group thought 50 feet of Satanka shale was substantial, so they increased it 50% just to make sure, right? And because there was one holdout of all of them, and they didn't want to have controversy, so they increased the safety margin by 50%. One of the things we have to consider is if we're going to see, someone would say that it's not arbitrary to move the western boundary west, but it is. And the reason is, like, the city's boundary is arbitrary. It's conveniently drawn on property lines. It's not along where the Satanka Shale changes, finally hits 75 feet. And the interesting thing is that when the margin is already built in, so the very least vulnerable place is right down there on the western boundary. It gets more vulnerable as you go east. So this is one of these things where, and a lot of that land is developed, right? Nobody's going to go put a feedlot between the church and the houses or whatever. It would be pretty, like you take the Turner tract and things like that. It's pretty easy to see what's going to be developed there. And it's likely to be homes. Well, and then the aquifer protection overlay has all of these prohibited uses already, right? So it'll be businesses that don't have pollutants and homes. And they will most likely, or for the most part, the sewage and storm sewer will go through sewer pipes and storm sewer pipes to the wastewater plant and the river. So the problem that we have is that we introduce regulations on private property owners without any compensation, right? We give them, it's kind of like a taking through, well, it is a taking through regulation without compensation. And so the question is this, is the western boundary important enough given the fact that there's already a 50% margin in the 75-foot, Satanka Shale? The reason that Aqua wants that is because they want more influence over that space. It's because it's like a religion. It's not really, when you consider all of the things on either side of the argument, when you thread the needle, this isn't justified for the pain that it causes landowners, because what happens in the difference between the city's aquifer protection overlay and the county's is nothing. There won't ever be anything built in there in the county's space that would put the citizens' water at risk. It's just a thing that it's a legal point that they use to try to make something happen. But if we make the boundary go to the city's boundary, that's more poorly defined than the county's boundary because it's drawn on section lines and it includes people who don't belong in it. The biggest risk to the aquifer is where the railroad and the interstate go through the aquifer overlay zone. A lot of that stuff up there is undevelopable, because we did the Pilot Hill purchase, and that took a whole bunch of it out of play without it being, without us having to regulate it, right? There's the public-private conflict is gone. You don't have pushback because that land belongs to the state. And in so many places up there, because of the steepness, because of the lack of utilities, the expense to get them there, jackhammering through bedrock and all kinds of stuff, it's there's a lot less pressure on the aquifer than people think. But the lots that are there that have been there, unbuilt ones that have been there for 20, 30, 50 years, this can't apply to because they are allowed to build in the rules when the subdivision happens. So this could relate to new subdivisions. But the rules treat the entire aquifer protection overlay the same, even though the western boundary is the area where it's the least vulnerable. because the margin on the 50% or the 50 feet of Satanka shale is 50% higher, you know, for the purposes of, it's just one of these bugaboos that some people have because I don't know why. And then, but it has real consequences.
Well, I'm one of those people that this bugaboo bothers. I think, you know, we need to allow for a margin of error.
It's already done.
Well, I guess I need to just put my 2 cents in here. The only thing that we have from the technological APOZ original group is the 75 feet that was signed by 20-some people's signature. Now, I've not seen any minutes that come up with this lore that there was 50
So
feet and it
you're
was
saying
above.
the story doesn't matter because you can't
No,
see
unless
it.
it's provable. Haven't seen any minutes. And so in the cap, it says 50, the lowest 50 feet of the Satanka shale is permeable. That's what it says. I'm not a geologist, but that's what it says. So the 75 feet is the only thing that we can go with.
Well, the line between permeable and not permeable is they figure the limit. It could be up to 50 feet, which is why they made it 75.
Well, they
right?
made it 75 and that's what they stamped and they put their professional reputation on the 75. So that's what I'm going to act as legally.
And what means will we use to determine where there's 75 feet to move the boundary?
Well, there's a many different ways. Some of them are pragmatic and some of them aren't. So we could hire
Well
a bunch
logs.
of-
So we know this, right? So well logs are one way, right? It's like dot to dot. It's like a cross section with big gaps, right?
And
But the city's boundary is not a reasonable boundary because it ignores all the science and just draws it where they felt like drawing it.
well, there were 3 geologists in my understanding that said that was a reasonable line. And then it also has a bit of pragmatism in there too. Right now, we don't have a line that is legally described. We don't have a line. And we know that line is not accurate. And so we have an undefined, inaccurate line. So we can either go do the studies and spend thousands of dollars, or we can take a study that's already been done, match up the city, give certainty to people planning so that we have the same maps. And then let's put in a place for exclusions. If people believe that they're not in the aquifer protection overlay zone, there should be an exclusion process.
Well, it's incumbent on, and it's property rights lie with the individual, not the government. It's incumbent on the government to prove that you should be included rather than you prove that you shouldn't. That introduces an unreasonable burden on a landowner whose rights are inherent.
This aquifer protection overlay zone was put on people in response to the protection of a shared resource. And so we might have a disagreement over what the property right and the ultimate property right is, but that's neither of us are attorneys. So I'm saying, can we define a boundary?
What I'm saying isn't, it's a legal point that's well established. I don't have to be an attorney to assert that.
Okay, well, I agree with Sue's perspective on this. I think there's an exclusion piece that could be put in here too, for a lot of reasons. Anything else on this piece?
Let's see. So then it stays intact, all property within zones 1, 2, and 3, David, all that. I guess when it says the easternmost edge of the line indicated on plate 1, do we have a date for that, plate 1? When that was established, that we could put the month, the day, the year, so we know which one we're referring to.
So what, if we're gonna keep plate 1 in there, then we'll have conflicting information, because plate 1 defines what they said was 75 feet. It's the curly bout, that boundary, the western boundary. So if you're going with the city's boundary, this probably just needs to be removed. Because, I mean, it'd be 2 different things. I have plate 1 in my office, but it's not defined on the ground or anything, so.
Okay,
Well, there's an image that we have in the planning office that is the most accurate. It's more accurate than the cities.
Our western boundary on plate one, is that the one you're talking about?
I don't know what it's called. I've just seen it.
Okay, the line as it sits now, is that what you're referring to?
It seems like it's more squiggly than the line as it exists now. I think the line that exists now is sort of in the center of the, you know, of the what would you call that? You'd call that the deviation. It would be the center of the deviation. The averages of all the squiggles so that you can kind of make a straight line.
Yeah, and I don't believe.
So some parts are included that wouldn't belong in there, and some parts have 69 or 74 feet of Satanka shale. So we already have a buffer on a buffer. I think it's interesting that, have you ever done the research to find out whether the 50 feet is documented somewhere and how that conversation went? Or are you just saying that the 75 feet is what was stamped?
Yeah, I'm saying I've read the Casper Aquifer Protection Plan, and in there 50 feet is described as permeable. The lower 50 feet of the Satanka shale, there was a margin of safety that was signed by 20-some professional geologists. So I guess I could go get one by 21 or 22, but why would I do that? Because people put their professional reputation on the line by stamping that, and that is what we've agreed to.
Well, what if they had said that, so 50 feet is the edge of permeability? And of course, it's not uniform all the way through. Some places might, depending on how tight the shale is, some places might be impermeable at 10 feet of Satanka shale, and some might be at 40, right? The 50 feet was the maximum that they thought anywhere along that line, the maximum permeability. So in some places, like if they had increased it by, 50 feet, if they'd have had a buffer that was 20%, so if they'd have said that, if they'd have defined it as 60 feet, then we wouldn't be having this discussion. Their margin of buffer is so complete that now we're fighting over something we shouldn't be fighting over.
Well, I was not in the room, and I don't believe you were either, but all we have is geologist stamped definitions, and I'm just.
What's fun is if you go talk to some of the geologists who originally worked on it, they would tell you that.
Yeah, well, I have talked to them, and they have not told me that, and so then I guess I would have to say, if you could produce those minutes. I have not seen anything in my research, nor have I heard any indication. So, that is a story I've heard you tell, and I'm not sure if it is or it isn't, because there's nothing legal to tell me that what you're saying is exactly accurate or lore. And so we have to go with what we have to go with. I do, and that's the 75 feet stamped by 20 plus professionals. I don't have any other refuting ability. I'm not a geologist. I'm not a hydrologist.
So if someone is inadvertently included when they have 75 feet of Satanka shale, how arduous are we going to make the process for them to get excluded?
I think down here at C, it says any property owner who believes that all or part of his or her property included in the APOZ should not be included may request an amendment to the APOZ delineation. And that is in our regulations as they stand right now. And so I'm guessing we can probably clean that one up if you don't like that, but here's an opportunity to.
Well, so of course, right. So they could request exemption out of, the line moved away from them. I guess the question is, how much would it cost them to do that?
well, they'd have to have a hire, or the county could hire an expert, a hydrologist or geologist and all, who is an expert in this, and then it'd be charged to that landowner.
The SSI, they could do an SSI.
So, yeah, what they would do is, I don't know what the extent would be, but they would probably look at well logs, and I don't know if they'd have to do a real new.
Well, I
wells.
think that if I were a landowner in that situation, if if the project was going to be built to me, if I found that I had 75 feet of Satanka shale, I'd probably sue the county to pay the legal, the fees for the study, right? But if I fell outside of 75 feet of Satanka shale, I might pay for it myself, right? Because I requested the study and I didn't meet the standard to move the boundary. It is a taking, and it's something we have to consider very carefully.
Yeah, I might disagree with you on that, but that's all right. I'm looking at the exclusion here. Is there anything in the exclusion from 1 through 3 that gives, does anybody want to change?
It's really interesting in 2, it says, evidence based on opinion alone without sound geologic field control is unacceptable. But that's the position we're using to move the boundary westward. The data doesn't exist to define what the line should be.
Well, I might disagree with you. There's some pragmatism around the line as suggested. It is legally defined because it's
Well,
a
I would
survey
accept that there are some places that don't have 75 feet of its Satanka shale that aren't included.
line. Right.
But there isn't sound geologic field control to define where that is. There isn't any to define. There isn't any more to define where the boundary is than there is to define where it isn't. So what you're asking a property owner to do is something that we don't require our own selves to do when we establish the western boundary.
Or they can just comply with the APOZ zone, right? They don't have to do an
Well,
SSI.
they're gonna anyway. Nobody's gonna put a feedlot up there.
Right, so then,
Their proximity to the western boundary makes their use, if you think about it, because of the way zoning works, it's not like somebody's gonna put some big industrial or chemical commercial operation right next to the edge of the western boundary as it is now, because the prohibited uses in the boundary create a pattern of use in the APOZ that makes it inconsistent with what's on the west side of the boundary. So it doesn't matter where the boundary is, because none of the things that would be excluded by the APOZ are going to be built up against that boundary anyway, because the uses are incompatible. They couldn't get the zoning anyway.
well, anything from 1 to 3 there that you would like to change?
Not necessarily like to change, but it probably could be condensed a little, and I can
Okay,
work with David with that if you want, just to have an exclusion paragraph.
okay. So we're working from D through the top of the table of prohibited activities. Anything from D through the table of prohibited activities that anybody would like to comment on? Beaver, anything?
No, I have no comments on
Okay.
the table of prohibited.
How about
activity.
table of prohibited activities? Does anybody see anything? So we'll zip through that. That's a couple of
I didn't
pages
see
long.
anything with that.
Okay. And we'll start here with setbacks from vulnerable features. David, we're on page 8. Jennifer on page 8. Just to let you know where we are. And we'll just do that piece. Anything, Beaver or Sue?
Actually, I think I'd like somewhere before we get into vulnerable features and all, have a paragraph about minimum lot size.
Okay,
And that could be, actually, I think that's going to set your numbers off a little bit, David. See, 4 was prohibited.
There might be a better place in this. We're still sort of in
Okay,
definitions. That might be in the regulations, the actual enforceable regulations part. We're still in definitions.
well, we're not.
yeah. Go ahead, Sue, just what would you propose?
Sorry, back up to my page. Just have a paragraph that says the minimum lot size would be, first of all, that it will be maintained agricultural zoning over the APOZ with the minimum lot size of 35 acres.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah,
if you don't mind me asking, who made the suggestions? Where did you get the,
I've been just reading all the comments coming in.
oh, you're saying that you drafted these, your own.
With help from others, yeah, from comments from the public.
So what's the basis for, we probably have to have a scientific reason, like let's say a nitrate loading study or something to justify
That's it
that
exactly.
lot size.
That's it exactly. The
But we
nitrate
don't have
levels
that.
have. Comments, I think there was reference to a study that the nitrate levels were up
Well,
due to, and would rise due to lot sizes that are a lot smaller, that many more dwellings on.
right, so, but
I think the study is.
the EPA or the
study.
DEQ would say that if you're going to regulate lot sizes, you have to have data that shows what the loading rate, what the allowable loading rate is. And 35 acres is an arbitrary number that sounds good, that affects people's, it's not defensible scientifically.
David, you had something
Yeah.
that you were,
I mean, I think what she's referring to is the WINK study. They did the study, and then the city did actually do a nitrate loading study off of that study. That I assume that's where that information is coming.
You know what's interesting? We could wind up in legal trouble for this because a single study isn't an adequate scientific sample. There's no control. They drilled right through the middle of the leach field and created during the study, when they misidentified the location of the leach field enough that they drilled right through it and created a path for the heavier nitrates to go right to the bottom of their hole. When we applied for the 205J grant and David was there, the purpose of it was to figure out loading for the purposes of lot size planning, except they made us promise that we wouldn't use a single data point for this purpose. And now you're suggesting that we use it for this purpose. So we would be in violation of the agreement we made with the DEQ not to do that. We need about 7 or 8 more just like it. And we need a control that's out in the prairie that's not anywhere near a septic system so that we can compare it to what a septic system does. We don't have the scientific justification for 35 acres. It wouldn't matter what we propose. We don't have the data for it.
And I will confirm that in the agreement we had with the state, they did have a provision in there that says we weren't going to use this for policy discussion until we had other studies to back it up. But
And what I find interesting about this is that your favorite scientists, see, we're practicing policy without a geologist, and I'll tell you why we're doing that and how. Any any respectable professional knows that the way you prove a hypothesis is by failing to disprove it. So you want to throw everything at it that you can, and you want it to stand up. It's like proving armor in a bunker, right? You got to blow up, you got to throw stuff at it. So, but they're not honest enough to go with what, yeah, I mean, we made agreements that we wouldn't use one single data point, and it's not scientifically honest unless you're an activist to try to go and then use that single data point, especially one that had flaws in its execution, because they drilled right through the center of the leach line and made a fluid path for the nitrates to go to the bottom of their hole. And this, if we use that study as a basis, as you say, for lot size, it's not adequate. 35 acres and agricultural zoning is arbitrary. It's just pulled out of thin air. That study can't support that. As a matter of fact, it can't even support its own conclusions until a bunch of other data points would either corroborate or refute. You'd have to create a pattern of data before you can make a conclusion. So,
Well, I would like to see that stuff that you referred to, David. We'll put this on hold.
Yeah,
for
I'll
a
find
minute.
that for you just to show you
Yeah,
what
but-
it says in there. So,
But we have to be very careful here to not impugn a professional geological survey. We've done that before, and I remember receiving a letter from the same company that said, should that continue, we're more than happy to come to the county commission meeting and address those which we consider to be assertions that aren't based in fact, and we can address them in the court of law. So we really do.
I would
need
absolutely go to court of law on that one, and I'll tell you why.
You'd have
I
to
didn't
convince somebody else.
I didn't attack anyone. What I did was I explained the scientific process and how there's not enough justification in this. And so if any professional suggests using this as data for planning purposes, they are not using they are not behaving in a professional manner, if that's what they're doing.
Well, yeah, and Avery, you're not a geologist, and
Do you know what? I'm a
tread very
policy
carefully.
maker,
Yeah.
and I'm trying to do it without a geologist because we don't have an honest one.
Wow. I think we have quite a few, quite honestly, and a lot of them disagree with me. But I still think they're geologists that are certified. Go ahead.
can I just address the agricultural zoning? So if we're gonna put that in here, I believe, and Jennifer, you can confirm or deny this, but I believe we'll have to change all of the zoning on our zoning map to show agricultural if we go forward with that part of it as part of this. So I don't think we could just put, everything's zoned agricultural. I think we do have to make the change to the map because it's kind of a separate document that's associated with the zoning.
Okay.
Okay,
I believe that's correct, because right now all that property has current zoning that
Yeah.
exists, and if we're gonna change that zoning, I'll have to look at the statute and talk to David about what that entails. Because I'm not certain.
Okay. So another
It's the
question.
same process, I
Yeah.
believe. Changing the zoning map's the same process. So it would just be, the zoning map would be changed and it would go forward.
If you didn't change the zoning, it just said one dwelling for 35 acres, would you have to change the zoning also?
No, not necessarily. I mean,
do you mean the agricultural
Agricultural zoning piece of that.
adjective?
Yeah.
if you eliminate that, then you have to go through that now.
That's okay.
The other thing I think we have to keep in mind is the family exclusion,
Right, and that's something we can't,
because that's in statute.
yeah, it's a statute. That's separate from zoning and actually in the statute, they changed it to say that our zoning cannot regulate that statute. So,
Okay,
I mean,
I can't preempt it.
right, that's the word, yep.
So we certainly won't do that.
Why not?
Well, you try to live within the law, right? Anything else here?
I think, shallow depth to groundwater was already defined, so I don't, back in definitions, actually. So I don't know if we need to have that whole rest of that in there.
So from and on, is that what you're saying?
And shallow depth to groundwater should just end there.
Shallow depth to groundwater should end at the Casper Formation. So is that what you're
No,
saying?
shallow depth to groundwater, that's it.
Okay,
Defined as any location where that's already been defined in under definition.
okay.
It was under vulnerable features.
So with the exception of 3 and defined, the cursor's not playing well with me.
Right, and so number 3 would just start with capitalized drainages and not defined.
So that and the highlighted would be gone. There.
Correct.
Okay. All righty, you guys keeping score? Awesome, okay. Anything through B, and then we'll go on to the next page if not.
You guys do realize that I know that the aquifer is vulnerable. And that is where our water comes from. And that for me, it's not an ideological thing. It's a practical thing. If the water were in danger. So what's interesting is that the professionals who comment on this don't ever put the risk in perspective. So we don't know if it's 100%, one more thing gets built up there and the water's done for, or if it's, there's no quantification of the risk. And it's a way to be reticent when it's a really important distinction to make, because you don't want the cure to be worse than the disease, as the case may be.
The problem with fouling an aquifer is you don't get another chance to undo that.
Well, right, but we don't have any. So what's interesting is it doesn't matter what I say, you can't even acknowledge the point. And the point is that because they're activists and they have an outcome in mind, they're reticent. They don't tell us things that we need to know. Such as if it's a 2% risk, then we could regulate too heavily. If it's a 98% risk, then we ought to be all in, right? But we don't know what it is because nobody ever tells us because they have an agenda. So I'm not against regulating on the aquifer. If I knew that the water was in danger, I'd throw down, I'd be all in. The problem is that in the whole conversation, there's all sorts of politics and weirdness that have nothing to do with science. And it's really important for us to not drink the Kool-Aid until we know what flavor it is, at least, and how many calories are in it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't regulate on top of the aquifer. We do, and it's good. And we did the Pilot Hill purchase, and that was good, despite all the votes against it. So here we are, and we don't have the right context to make these regulations the way you intend to make them. We don't. And so when I say that, people think that I'm the enemy of the water in the aquifer, or that I am some stooge for evil corporate robber barons or something, whatever people think about conservatives. But I'm apolitical on the subject. I just want the appropriate data to make the decision. And I don't buy the Chicken Little argument that property rights are less important than the common good of water. There has to be some quantification of that. And there never has been. So we have rules that treat the entire aquifer overlay zone as the same risk, even though we know it isn't. And then we have people who want to regulate no matter what. And I don't know if their reasons are anti-development, if they like the view, but they're extrajudicial, they're extra legal. They are not we don't have the scientific justification to do this. And mostly what we hear is inside an echo chamber, a bubble of activism. And we hear it enough that we believe it, but we haven't seen the evidence.
Now, come on,
And so
man.
what-
I
when
mean,
you're in-
like, we had our own study not done a year ago that showed exactly what everybody suspected before that study, that nitrates moved down just like they did in the aquifer, like they proposed before that
Which
study.
study is that?
The Wank study, right?
That was after they drilled through the middle of the leach line and
They've
created
done
a
two-
fluid path. Hey, I'm a septic professional.
You are not an engineer.
Do you want to know what? I
So-
know more about how water moves in dirt as it relates to septic than civil engineers do. And the reason I do is because I have years and years of experience. I may not have a stamp,
Yes,
but
you
I
need
know,
that.
because it's
Legally,
what
you
I
need
do.
that. So.
And what I'm telling you is, we can't use that as a study. So if you're gonna say something, make it more useful than that. That Wang study is garbage because they drilled through the middle of the leach line. You have to make 8 more points that corroborate the Wang study, or we'll have to pay back the damn grant.
No, you said there's no understanding of risk. Yes, there is an understanding of risk, right? Now, it's
No,
not
I
a
think that
complete
there
or
is.
perfect understanding
I
of
think that
risk.
there is, but they don't tell
Would
us.
you like to
And the
either speak
reason
or
they
would you
don't
like to
tell
be
us-
done speaking?
The reason they don't tell us what the risk is because it's practical reticence. They know, the geologists know, and they purposely leave that out because it doesn't support their assertions.
Well, I would disagree. So,
But you don't know, you just want to disagree.
no, well, I
But
don't
you
know, and
say-
neither do you.
I
You say
do.
that you are concerned about the aquifer. and all,
Absolutely.
When this is our primary source of water for most residents of Albany County, why wouldn't we act proactively and take care of this instead of reactively after something has happened and all? We know, we've seen that development continues to go to the east. And I'm not against development, but I'm for sound development. And so why wouldn't we
Okay.
act
Here's why,
proactively?
here's why. If you go into the Laramie Plains subdivision, where the oldest wells are and the densest land is, the densest development, some wells have good water and some wells don't, and they're right next to each other. So if the aquifer is contaminated, if there's a plume of nitrates in the aquifer, it would show up in all the wells. But because it's checkerboard and the wells are only cemented somewhere between 15 and 30 feet down, and the cement, in other words, the seal of the casing of those wells is like 60, 70 years old. Some of those houses have been there since the 50s, right? That's 70 years. And so if there was a well standard that required you to cement, so it's basically it's open hole. It's a steel pipe in an open hole. If you were to cement the well casing all the way to the production zone, then you don't have a fluid path down the well for it to pollute itself from what's right around it at the top. So the point is, if a well has a nitrate issue, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's coming from the aquifer. And a lot of the aquifer, because it's layered, you have these layers that have hydraulic pressure in them. They're confined. Artesian pressure. So you punch through and all of a sudden the water comes up in that well 40, 50, 60 feet, right? So it's feeding from the bottom. And then you have a non-cemented casing above it, and the nitrates are running down into the well and they're producing the well, and the aquifer doesn't have a problem, only the well does. And the answer is to plug and abandon the well and drill another one right next to it and cement it all the way to the production zone. And then you don't have any nitrates right next to it. So if it was and it's been done in the Valley View subdivision. That water in the Valley View subdivision is super dense, super dense. Those lots are tiny. And this guy had a really bad nitrate problem. So he plugged and abandoned his well. Now, all the rest of them are like 0.2, 0.4. It's the best water in any of the wells out on the whole aquifer. That is the lowest nitrate, except for one well. So there's not a plume in the aquifer because he's the only one with a problem. If there was a plume, they'd all show it, like regionally. And out on the edges, it would be less, right? On the edges of the plume. And then when finally you'd be able to define the plume by the water testing pretty much. Except here's a screwed up well in a totally pristine part of the aquifer, and it's the only one. So he plugged and abandoned it, poured concrete all the way to the bottom, and moved over 30 feet and drilled another one and had water the same as everyone else in the aquifer. So the point is, if you are a scientist and you want a certain outcome, your best tool is to consider all the things that contradict it. If you cherry pick the things that fill your narrative and you don't give equal weight to the things that don't, then you're not behaving like a scientist. And we have a whole bunch of that. And there's a group out there that has years and years of well testing data that's private. And they have informed me that they intend to use it in legal action to prove that the science doesn't justify what you guys are trying to do here today. And they have the proof. The numbers don't fit the narrative. As a matter of fact, they contradict it solidly.
Well, it'd be nice if they would publicly comment because everybody's just trying to do the right thing here.
The problem
The
that they
interesting
have is
piece-
that they have concern about the honesty of the professionals who are advising on the subject. And so they're going to wait to do it in court.
Okay, well, you should never be worried about future litigation when you're trying to do the right thing. And so if it happens, it happens. And
It's
you
better
move
to do
forward.
the legal thing.
Yeah. And there are plenty of data points. There was a master's project, I believe, many years ago where a person was sampling hundreds of people out on the aquifer with their water samples. So I think that is also available.
And those wells weren't cemented to the production zone.
Okay, so just working on this again. Setbacks from the vulnerable features were through B, unless you need to do something else.
If we were to, well, we can't do it, but if the state engineer were to require wells to be cemented all the way to the perforated pipe, all the way to the water down there, this problem wouldn't exist.
Well, we can't do that. Can't tell the state engineer what to do, so we're left with what we can do.
And the problem with the Wink study is that they only went 30 feet. So if nitrates are reduced 50% in 30 feet, what happens in the next 30 feet? And the next 30 feet after that?
Anything
They
through
didn't go deep enough,
B or C.
despite the fact that they drilled right through the leach line and created a fluid path for the nitrates. Also, here's my hydrogeologist going right here. They had to reconstitute the nitrates. The nitrates couldn't move because there wasn't enough liquid to move them. They had to add water to pull nitrates back out. So they aren't moving very fast or at all if you have to add water to pull nitrates out.
This item 6, the APOZ development permit. An APOZ development permit shall be required with applications for a zoning certificate, subdivision permit, conditional use or zoning change. Anything with that, David? You know, we're on 6, page 9. Sue Eber, anything down to 1 below B, since we can read all of that. Okay. And if it's wording, we can handle that at some other time if
Right.
it's substantive. Okay. So we'll move down through B. An APOZ development permit will be approved if the following criteria are met. Anything on that one? Through 1, 2, or 3? Okay. I will have a piece on 9 and 10. The county shall contract with professionals on a rotating basis for each SSI review. I think the person should contract with whoever they want. The county should contract with whoever they want. I think the person paying should be able to get the person that they want to get.
I think it's different for a private person than the government.
And how so?
Well, and because the way government procures services, we either have to rotate or put it out for bid. A private individual could choose anybody they want because nobody can make them. That's their right. I'm not sure that. I mean, I guess it would depend on what the process looks like. So maybe it shouldn't say rotating basis even for the county, because that we might get, you rotate, you might get people who lack knowledge in the area.
Right.
Just because somebody has a stamp doesn't mean that that's their expertise.
Yeah, I'm not
area.
comfortable with that rotating either, because in the application process, you could wait to apply to get the person that you want.
Right. So I think our procurement, if we go above 25,000, I agree with you. An RFP we should always have that as a standard practice, whether it's aquifer review or auditing.
Is there any value in entertaining disagreeing viewpoints from licensed geologists? You know, whatever the nuances are, the areas of agreement and disagreement across that profession. Is there any value in doing that?
I don't know that I would understand the question.
Well, some in that profession, you know, not me, people who have stamps, mind you.
Yeah.
There's actually a pretty wide opinion based on all the same data. In other words, wide different conclusions drawn from the same, because everybody has access to the data. Studies are published. If you're in that profession, you know how to go into the study and look at its method and data points and conclusions. And so if it was super tight, everyone would agree, right? Or the disagreements would be minimal or negligible or not substantial. But in this discussion, there are wide disagreements in the profession about the conclusions drawn or the qualities of the studies, how they're written, how they're, you know, it's how it's written, it's the methods to execute it and the way you draw conclusions, right? So is there any value in us taking input, technical input, and getting understanding of more viewpoints on the subject?
Of that piece of the aquifer protection overlay zone, the rotating basis, or
No,
all of this?
all the pieces.
Well, when we are finished with this, it goes back out to public review, and people are more than welcome. In fact, we made a button and a form to make that easier for people to.
No, I'm not talking about
piece.
public comment. I'm talking about professional opinions on the matter.
Well, they can.
Professionals can comment.
Right.
And the reason I was asking you the question is because I want to know what your opinion is on the subject.
My opinion is more public input better. And more
So-
public
So
input
you're
that is
asking to-
technically expertise is helpful.
I'm
To
asking,
specifically draw that information.
yeah, I'm asking you guys a question. Basically how hell-bent you are on this. If you got contradictory information, if that would have value to you.
It always has value.
Possible in your policy process.
Of course.
It always has value to me.
And there, we have a process, Heber, and it's public input.
So
And
why doesn't,
we allow that
it has
time?
been my experience up to this point that the contradictory opinions are dismissed by the city, not by the county, because I entertain all the opinions, right? And I think about them. And even though I can't practice geology because I don't have a stamp. Sometimes people accuse me of it, but I don't, because I don't stamp anything, right? But people who do they've made an oath, they have a legal requirement as a licensed professional to tell the truth and to tell facts and truth in their appropriate context, to not be reticent. So I can say that I am perfectly inclined to entertain any professional opinions. But professional opinions don't only have to stand up to my scrutiny, they have to stand up to the scrutiny of their peers, right? And we don't really do that.
No, that's for the licensing board. If you remember at the wind regulations, there is somebody who's being submitted for one of their expertises on the wind regulation. Somebody has challenged their expertise and their finding and has taken it to that appropriate licensing board, which is the process. And so if there is a disagreement with somebody's expertise, then that licensing board is the proper place to have that conversation. It's not at this county commission board.
Well, so my question was, are we willing to consider, before we pass regulations this draconian, we have to be willing to consider, we have to make sure we're right.
Yeah, and I'm really hopeful. I would disagree with your assertion that it's draconian. But
Well,
what has been
if
passed.
we're right, it's not draconian. If we're not right, it is.
Well, that's up for your interpretation. I mean, at this point, nothing
But you
is.
can agree with that. That's a pretty easy thing to agree with. If
I
we're
think
right,
we've said, Heber, we'd be willing to entertain any comments.
I was just
input.
wanting Pete to agree with me once.
Well, I don't agree it's draconian, man. I mean, like.
No, what I said was, if we're wrong, it's draconian. If we're right, it's not draconian. And you couldn't even agree with that statement.
Well,
It's pretty simple.
okay, I'll agree I'll agree with that statement. I mean, it's not a hill for me to die on. So anything here, I have a problem with the positive effects of the recommendations of the SSI. That it's just a non-scientific. That's asking for somebody to do something. The positive effects of the recommendations of the SSI. I don't even know what that means. So I would have, my assertion is to remove that. Item 4, any positive effects of the recommendations of the SSI. I'm not even sure what that asks for. And I'm not sure.
Right, what does that mean?
Yeah, so that my take on this is that would be, our document would be better without it. Anything else through 8? Heber,
No,
anything through 8?
aside from just
Mhm.
changing wording as far as, that's just wordsmith and that's nothing.
So from 4 down through 7 on page 10.
Yeah, I would say strike item 5 altogether because it's covered under the following paragraph.
Right, are those two there?
Yeah.
maybe it would be easier to delete it from number 6, because then we don't have to renumber the items.
Yeah,
If you take a whole item out, then you have to renumber. We'll probably have to renumber now.
yeah, I think
Yeah, I think under,
anything through
Close
7.
let's see. Yeah, I think looking at this too, number 7 needs to be struck out because it's a repeat of B3 on page 9.
Does it matter which
Preceding.
section it's in? I mean, is it in 2 places because of what the heading is, you know? It'd be hard to go.
So that's an A.
That's already been
development
said.
permit.
Over here in, under section B3.
But this is under the criteria of, for approval, right? So this is kind of like a checklist. So maybe it ought to be listed in there, even though it's outlined somewhere else. This is, an APOZ development permit will be approved if the following criteria are met. If we take that out of there, that could be an issue.
I think Sue's saying that 3.
See, under
above
B3 covers,
B3
that-
covers 7, which is B7, if it were to be thought about.
Oh, I got you. I thought you were talking about where it said, talked about that before.
no, it's already there, so I don't think it's required under a separate item number 7.
Do you have any idea about that, David, at all? Why there would be 2 mentions, kind of a very similar subject matter under the same topic?
Kind of. I thought there was a reason.
It's
I
all
think-
under the permitting process.
So 7, I think, gave the option of the county to go outside of the county, saying basically, if we have a qualified professional in-house, then they can do it. But if they don't, then we may go out and hire qualified professionals.
Well,
But I
you're
don't know if
saying
it-
on county staff, let's
Yeah,
say.
yeah. And I don't know if that's, I think we could still do the same thing with what it says in 3.
I'm fine with,
I don't know how many
Whatever,
hours
I
we're moving it,
just-
so.
I don't, maybe, and this isn't the place, but David could probably figure out if there aren't any conflicts and whether that's restating the
Right.
same thing.
I agree with you. on
That's
that.
true.
Because it might be restated for a purpose
Right.
that I'm not seeing right away.
Beaver, I agreed with you.
Thanks, man.
Just an attempt to clean things up a little bit, Heber, but I totally agree with you.
Okay, 11, we're on page 11 under C, site-specific investigation. I think under I, the mapped, I think we should just be worried about vulnerable features, whether they're mapped or not mapped. And so if somebody discovers a vulnerable feature, a search to determine the presence of vulnerable features on the improvement site says that it makes it stronger to me.
We don't have C2 one, just creating the word map.
Yes. So anything through 5 there, under 2, page 11, the SSI and report shall include the following.
I think item 6, isn't that just saying the same thing as 1, 2, 3?
So David, would you highlight that? Take a look at that. If that's a restatement of 1, 2, and 3. Item 6 there, a characterization is that.
I would say it's not, because 2 is a site narrative. 3
No,
is an
no.
on-site investigation.
You're saying
I'm
this one.
saying 6 is saying the same as I, 3.
and this one is the same as, virtually the same as 6.
Correct. An on-site investigation determined.
So which language do you like better?
3,
Because they do say the same thing now that I'm looking at it. And 6 is the same thing, only general. It's like gibberish. And I mean, it's not, but it's very non-specific, and 3 is more specific, right?
right,
Okay,
yeah.
noted. 7, anything on 7, and then we'll move to page 12.
I guess just wordage that instead of the presence of vulnerable features on the improvement side, it's just the features and conditions that were identified up above on 3.
Okay, so reroute that back to 3.
Yeah,
Okay. David, Jennifer, you got that?
did you get that,
Okay.
Jen? Or David?
Okay, moving on to item, or page 12, starts with Roman numeral 5, I8 there. And anything from 8, 9, or 10, because that's what we can read entirely. Being 8, 9, and 10.
It's funny that depth to groundwater business is usually language like that is in low land where, like floodplain type stuff. And of course, up there, that ground only carries surface water once every 5 years.
Okay, we'll work on 11 and the rest of page 12, anything from 11, and then D1 or 2. I don't really know what item 1 means under D. Any building or structure proposed on property zoned residential before August 7th, 2012. Does that mean they have a building permit that they haven't used since 2012?
No, it means they're not, this is about the APOZ development permit, which is not a building permit. This is like a separate permit. But that or it's in conflict with the regular zoning certificates, right? But the idea is that if a subdivision is developed under previous rules and the new rules make your land undevelopable, unusable, then that's a taking and it would require some compensation. So we have a choice. If we wanted to eliminate that, then any properties who can't comply with the new rules, we'd have to buy.
Well, number 2 covers the subdivision, right? It says any building or structures proposed in the subdivision with the subdivision permit approved prior to August 7th, 2012. I understand that. This one says any building or structures.
So the August 7th, 2012, that's the last time we updated the zone or the aquifer protection overlay zone. And that was the original update after the cap was adopted. And so what this is supposed to say, and if it's not clear, then it needs to be reworded, but what it's supposed to say that is if the property was zoned residential before August 7th, 2012, then if you want to build on that property or do buildings or structures, then you're basically exempt from the new standards, because that's what this is an exemption. Does that make sense?
So that 1 is related to zoning changes. Yeah, the other 2 is related to subdivision permits. So 1 appears like it's related to building permits, but it's not. It's zoning changes.
Well, prior to 212, we didn't have any protection for the aquifer, correct?
Oh, no, we did.
Yeah, we
That's
did.
not-
Yeah, it's been adopted for quite a while.
Yeah.
Oh, I meant
Early 2000s.
the zoning prior to 2012 had nothing to do with aquifer protection.
So I mean, we had an aquifer protection overlay zone. The zoning in prior to then, I don't know. I mean, our new zoning regulations, they were adopted in 2015. So with the new zoning maps, I guess I'm not following.
If there's already platted subdivisions, then what's the point of having this item?
Item one. This is just for zoning. Is that what you're?
Because
Yeah,
I
so-
suppose a lot in a platted subdivision, somebody could ask for a zoning change.
So in our regulations that were adopted in 2012, there was a couple of different exemptions. One was there's a previously platted subdivision. And two, if the zoning was residential before 2012, then any buildings or anything would be exempt. So there's two different exemptions that it's talking about. One, it was zoned residential before 2012. So anything on that property is exempt from site-specific investigations and some of those other things. And then two, if it was in a previously platted subdivision, it doesn't have to be necessarily have been in a previously platted subdivision to be zoned residential before 2012. So there's two different things. So like if it was a 35-acre lot and it was zoned rural residential, it wasn't in a platted subdivision because we don't do platted subdivisions unless it's less than 35 acres. So those are the exemptions. I don't know if that clears anything up. That's it's splitting those two things out. It took what was in the previous regulations and it tried to clean it up a little bit, but obviously caused more confusion.
Well, it's pretty simple. This, I mean, somehow we're overthinking this. What it's saying is that it is if it was residentially zoned before August 7th, 2012, if we approve a zoning change from residential to non-residential, which would be, I don't know, commercial or whatever, that the property won't be exempt by that paragraph. In other words, if you change the zoning, you lose your grandfather. That's what I think that means.
Yeah, so if they do change the zone.
So if I had a lot zoned residential before that date, I wouldn't have to do site-specific investigation. I'm entitled to the rules at the time, but if I go and change the zoning, you know, it's like updating a building that doesn't have fire suppression. Once you go to update it, then you have to comply with all the codes, right? So as long as they leave it residential, it doesn't, the new stuff doesn't kick in. It only kicks in if they're asking for a zoning change, because then they would fall under the most current rules. Is that right?
Yeah.
So let me use an example here. So
Okay.
the Rocky Ridge subdivision, that parcel was zoned rural residential prior to it going through the subdivision, or in 2012. Prior to 2012, all those 35-acre lots were zoned rural residential. Because it was zoned residential before 2012, they then did not have to complete a site-specific investigation. And that was the big thing, is that they got out of that. And so they were able to go through they did a site-specific investigation, but because they didn't, they weren't required to, we never reviewed it. I mean, we reviewed it, but we didn't hire a geologist to review it because it wasn't part of the regs at that time. So that's kind of the situation. So it had nothing to do with the platted subdivision. It had to do with the zoning. They were now not allowed or not needing to do that. But this actually changes that, I believe. So if they do some,
If he wanted to make one lot in that area commercial, it probably wouldn't do it for the whole subdivision, but for that lot, it would, they'd have to do a site-specific investigation and all that stuff. If they were allowed to change their zoning. I mean, I suppose they could just get flat denied. That's the reason behind the 35-acre lots. It's not science, it's process. The 35-acre ag zoning would preclude or make it really hard to ask for a zoning change to residential. So people say that it's scientific, but it's not. It's because to do a zoning change in the aquifer protection overlay requires you to jump through some hoops that are challenging, and that makes it more challenging. It's not science.
Can you research that just a little bit for me, David, and hope, I know you provided a discussion here, and you said August 7th, 2012 was the last update of the cap. Is that, what was August 7th, 2012? Why that
Yeah,
date?
that was the update of a major update of the cap. I'm not sure if we did any changes since then, but I'll look into that.
Okay, thank you.
Well, so we have to distinguish between cap and APOZ, right? Because one's a plan.
Yeah.
Which is like the reason for the regulations, and the other is the regulations, right? So you can't enforce the cap. It's just a plan. You enforce the regulations.
Yeah, the cap was updated in 2011, in January 2011, and then this was actually the aquifer protection overlay, so it was updated on August 7th, 2012.
This was the reg,
This was the regs.
as opposed to the cap,
Correct.
which is,
Yeah.
it's like a master plan. It's not a legally enforceable document. It's not. It's what you base your regs on.
It becomes enforceable when you, adopt regulations.
Right.
You could have any master plan or comprehensive plan say anything it wants. It's interesting, people come here and cite comprehensive plans all the time. But unless the regs are written to reflect what's in the comprehensive plan, then it makes the comprehensive plan. Right? It's not
Okay,
an enforcement thing.
item 13, anything on item, or excuse me, page 13, not item 13.
Just that last item 3, any accessory building structures or additions to existing building structures that are consistent with the residential zoning. I'd like added.
Well, that goes without saying. That doesn't have to say that, because residential zoning has all of its definitions. And so if they have that zoning, they're only allowed to do certain things in that zoning. Right? You don't have to say you can't build
But the
a welding
preceding
job.
just discussed changing that zoning.
That just, oh my gosh. Those are not, the language in 1 doesn't require the addition of a restatement in 3. Those aren't connected like you're seeing them being connected.
So yeah, any review we would do, I mean, we review this and we also review the other zoning. It's not like we would allow, I don't know. This is an overlay, so anything additional we would look at, but the zoning should regulate to make sure that we're not putting something on it that's not in accordance with the zone. Basically.
So this
But
is,
I don't care. I mean, it's just, I mean, if we put that language, it's not hurting anything either. So.
okay. We'll be moving to page 13 here.
Could you repeat that real quick? So I.
Yeah, that's, let's see, any accessory buildings / structures or additions to existing buildings / structures that are consistent with residential zoning.
Well, I don't think you want to say residential, it would just be consistent with the zoning. Because what if it's commercial? You know, I guess the point is you don't want somebody building something that's not consistent with the zoning, regardless of what the zoning is, right? And my point was that can't happen anyway. We don't have to
Well-
state that for it to be that way.
And commercial
already
would
that
fall
way.
under investigation SSI anyway, right?
What does?
If you would be expanding, any unlimited expanding, and you put a commercial, it should be reviewed by an SSI anyway. So,
They're all reviewed and they all have to be consistent with their zoning. So that's why that language isn't necessary. It goes without saying, or it's already stated lots of times other places.
okay, I'm good with that.
Okay, item, or page 13, item E through B. E on 6, 7, 8, A and B. Anything here? So, David, is there any utility in saying, and in accordance with the DEQ, Wyoming DEQ standards under A? So under the installation design of septic systems located within the APOZ must be in accordance with plans and specifications certified by a professional engineer or professional geologist registered to practice in the state of Wyoming and in accordance with all regulations required by the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality.
Well, it says that in the next sentence. Basically, that it doesn't grant the right to install a septic system or small wastewater treatment system that would be otherwise forbidden by county or state regulation. So
Where you,
the very next sentence. So basically, if we were to insert DEQ, in that,
okay,
at the end of that first sentence, we could delete the second sentence entirely, and that might be more nimble. I don't know. It's like,
right.
why does it take 3 lines or 2.5 lines in there to say DEQ?
I guess they're tough to write these things. So I wouldn't want to do that. So it's fine where we are. So let's go from 7. Design standards for on-site wastewater treatment systems. Let's get as much as we can up there. So A and B, anything on A and B? We can just strike my last comment. That doesn't need to worry about it. That. Anything on page 13 A and B? Okay.
This is super fun for me. Because anytime we pump a septic, we do an inspection.
Yeah.
That's the whole point.
I've had that done in my parents' property, but I didn't pay much attention. What does that entail? Just kind of for my own basic knowledge, Eber, you know about that?
Well, you just look for all the ways that they can fail, but you have to know what that means, right?
Right.
So if a septic tank itself cracks or leaks, then it's like a little mini sewer treatment plant, right?
Right.
It's a digester. And the reason it's the size it is so that the water running in has a certain time of residence in there for the bacteria to clean it up. So if you get a crack in the tank itself, and it won't hold enough water, it won't hold water at all, then it becomes like a vault toilet, right? That, in a campground, it would just pile up sewage and there would be no digestion taking place because there's no media for the bacteria to live, right? But you almost never see cracked septic tanks. You just don't. The precast world is pretty good at what they do. And, I mean, 50-year-old septic tanks don't leak. It's remarkable. So that's kind of inspecting the tank.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty simple physics. It's remarkably simple, right? You need the pipes to run at the appropriate grade so that they'll not clog up. And that doesn't have any effect on groundwater or anything. That's just if something was poorly installed, it will cause the homeowner problems and make their life miserable. But from a release standpoint, something, there's nothing concerning about that. But so So when I inspect one, I'm inspecting it for all kinds of reasons, not just the reasons that would be in here.
Right.
Right. One of the things that people, and I've heard it a lot by policymakers, they worry about what happens when a septic system fails. And what's funny is that when a septic system fails, it doesn't pollute the aquifer because it won't leach. You know, that's when it's the least permeable. So people say, failing septic systems, that's bad for the aquifer. And it's not true. It's just bad for the person's basement, right? It's bad for their carpet. If you imagine the soil's like in a microscope, it's like a fishbowl full of marbles, right? The particles have spaces between them. And depending on how the size of particles, so like clay is, I don't know, it's like 1/10,000th. A particle of clay is like, you could put 10,000 of those or some ridiculous 5,000 of those at the size of a coarse piece of sand, right? So that's why some soils are more permeable than others. And the time of residence in the soil is what gives bacteria time to work on it. So on the tank side, the bacteria in there clean up all the solids. They eat the organic material. But there's dissolved carbon, dissolved nutrients in the form of nitrogen, like fertilizer, that goes out into the leach field, and then it sits out there, and the bugs out there keep eating the nitrates, right? So the question is, can the soils hold that long enough so that the microbiotic activity can sufficiently clean up the water? And in most cases it does. So if I'm doing a percolation test and it perks too fast, that's a problem. We have to bring in different dirt to slow it down. Otherwise, we'll have half-treated effluent running away from us before we can treat it, and we want it to stay there, right? So that the bacteria can clean it up. But when a septic system fails, 50 years of ooies and gooeys and specks and flecks have plugged up all the spaces between the soil particles, and at that point it won't leach. So failure means the opposite of it finding its way somewhere, because it can't anymore. So it's always made me crazy when I'm in a joint meeting with city council or something. We're like crying about failing septic systems when the opposite happens. They don't leach. They back up in the homeowner's house. There's no nitrates going anywhere because they can't. It's sealed off like gooey sealed off over time. Like it's like wearing your tires out. You know, it's something that's designed for progressive failure, and it leaches slower and slower across its life until it can't do what the amount of water you're using, right? Can't keep up.
So do you do a perk test every time you pump the sewer?
No, the
No.
perk test is only done for the purposes of designing the system.
Okay.
To figure out what footprint it has to be able to handle, you know, a designated amount of water per day.
Okay.
Based on the size of the home, you know, how many people can live in it, right?
Okay. Thank you. Item 4 or page 14, starting with C, and it looks like we can see all the way down to 2. Any changes here? Down, we have non-conforming uses on it. So for me, B, we shouldn't allow for expansion of non-conforming uses. They are just that, not conforming uses. And at some point, we're hopeful that those non-conforming uses go away so that they are conforming. So I don't believe there should be an expansion for non-conforming uses. I believe the pre aquifer regulations as opposed to this were better than that on expansion.
You know what's interesting about that?
What's that?
Well, so in the case of a certain fuel station, there will be those who argue that some improvements constitute expansion. So there's a possibility that if we don't allow that and we can't take away the non-conforming use, that we're allowing substandard equipment to remain in place. And the underground storage tank project, maybe Sue's never heard this before, but when you buy a gallon of fuel, the EPA found, look, here's the narrative. The EPA wanted to clean up all the Uncle Joe's gas stations from 1930 to 1970 or whatever, you know, where there were no standards. You just put a tank in the ground and pump fuel out, right? So that's why we have all these little cleanup-y things around town. But what they found is that operators would hide a mishap because they didn't want to be penalized. So they shifted the program to be something that's symbiotic rather than adversarial. So when you buy a gallon of gas, some portion of the gallon of fuel pays into the environmental remediation fund. So if a fuel station operator has a spill or a problem, because everyone's paying into this fund, the remedy is free. It's prepaid. So there's no incentive for the operator of the fuel station to not report it. Because then rather than being adversarial and getting fined and all of these things, the only time they get fined is if they don't report it. Otherwise, the underground storage tank program pays for the repairs and the cleanup, right? Because incentivized compliance is more effective than punishment. And also then it's pre-funded, so things don't fester and get nasty and bad and horrible, right? So the problem that we have with Pete's proposal here is that if we prohibit what could be regarded as an expansion, I guess it would depend on how we define expansion. But if we prohibit that and the underground storage tank program wants to pay to remedy it, something that's a risk, and we prohibit that, the liability shifts from the underground storage tank program to the county government because we didn't allow the best, because our rules preclude the operator making that improvement. So if we want clean water, we would be less concerned about an improvement to that we would want improvement to that property, whatever it looks like, and the technical equipment on it, like double walled tanks and leak detection and all that kind of stuff. So we have to be careful, because if we what's the word? Preempt. If we preempt a non-conforming use from taking advantage of the underground storage tank program, we assume the liability for cleanup because we forced that person, that operator, to keep bad technology in place.
But the expansion, I thought, meant more growth here than updating your equipment.
Well, but what Aqua would say, what the ideologues say is they don't want a single piece of gravel put down on there. They don't want a membrane under the gravels to catch, in the parking lot. The notion is to squash that guy, to stop him from doing anything. As a matter of fact, they were arguing that that even expanding hours was an expansion. So not just a physical expansion, but they were arguing that because that was sort of a seasonal business before, and this guy bought it and he runs it all year long, that constituted an expansion. Like that somehow the government could limit his revenue or something. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Rather than just a physical print. So we're dealing with people who don't understand or don't care about definitions of law. They want to squash that use. And because we can't legally squash the use, we probably ought to be more nimble and figure out how to minimize its damage rather than
Yeah, but we're also.
deal with our feelings.
Owner out there who didn't report a leak.
The previous guy,
Well, isn't the repair, your suggestion here covered in paragraph A here, Heber? A description of the damage, a description of the planned repairs and how they maintain.
the problem that
Documentation.
this commission will run into is
Yeah.
what the definition of an expansion is. Because certain preferred constituents think that an expansion of hours is an expansion. They think that an expansion of number of months in operation is an expansion. That replacing, leaky fuel lines is an expansion. That adding parking is an expansion. So if we prohibit the expansion and we don't carefully define what that is, the county could end up, if we preempt the underground storage tank program's best standards rule, we could wind up the taxpayers of Albany County with the liability. And what's interesting about that is that the station owner wouldn't be liable, the taxpayers would. And the reason for that is because the station owner has a remedy that we prohibited him from using.
Well, in our zoning resolution, non-conforming use, except in the APOZ, has no ability to be expanded. Is that correct? So a non-conforming use in our Albany County zoning regulations.
It's true. That was
So why would we grant more powers in an APOZ than we would in normal zoning? I don't see the need, right? It's not that this is less sensitive than regular zoning. This is more sensitive. Why would we grant special powers in an APOZ? I don't believe in the expansion.
Well, it's not special powers. That would apply anywhere in the whole county.
Well, why is this?
If we had rules that prevented truck stop ABC over at Curtis to Street,
So why
if it
is this even
precluded them
covered
from
here,
using.
David, if it's already in our county regs? If it's
So,
already under, I think I saw it in chapter 3, section 6 or something like that,
Yep.
that it's already covered.
right,
So
so
why should it be here?
well, the first reason is this is what was in the Casper Aquifer Protection Plan, the original Casper Aquifer Protection Plan and the updated plan. So this is what the language, this is the information that the community came up with. So that's why it originally got in here. Excuse me. The second reason is this is so specific. These regulations are so specific to this area that using that not the non-conforming use standards in the zoning doesn't get to all of this the specificity that this set of regulations has. And that's I guess the biggest thing for me is just that's what was in the cap, and that's why it ended up here. And I wasn't involved with the update so much, or even obviously not the original. I wasn't even here, So I don't know why that was a big deal, but this is information that was in the original city cap as well. And I'm not sure if it is now with their updated cap, but that's where it came from. Is the plan. So.
Yeah, so I'm just looking under the 32122, actually non-conforming uses under our zoning certificate or zoning updated. If active and continuous operation of a non-conforming use is discontinued for a period of 24 consecutive months, all subsequent uses shall be in compliance with the scope and intensity of the uses for the district in which use is located. That's A. B. No non-conforming use shall be expanded beyond the use in existence at the time of the adoption of this resolution. C. No non-conforming use shall be changed to another non-conforming use. D. No non-conforming use shall be relocated unless moved to a location where the use would no longer be non-conforming. So our non-conforming uses, and thank you for the explanation. I don't believe we should have expansion. Jennifer, do you obviously have a take? Thank you.
Well, and not so much about that. I was just gonna add that it might be helpful to reference, there is a statute on the continuation of non-conforming uses, which is 18.5.207. Specifically, A says, a zoning resolution enacted under the provisions of Wyoming Statute 18.5.201 through 206 shall not prohibit the continuance of the use of any land, building, or structure for the purpose for which the land, building, or structure is used at the time the resolution is adopted, and it is not necessary to secure any certificate permitting such continuance. However, the alteration or addition to any existing building or structure for the purpose of affecting any change in use may be regulated or prohibited by zoning resolution. If a non-conforming use is discontinued, any future use of such land, building, or structure shall be in conformity with the provisions of the resolution regulating uses in the area in which the land, building, or structure is located. So the statute does cover parts of that for you.
Yeah, so expansion is not required for us to be put in here by statute.
So expansion is the part which is debatable always, because it says the alteration or addition to any existing building or structure for the purpose of effectuating any change in use. So it depends upon how you define change in use.
So in that, and that's where it gets a little sticky too, because we're talking about the use of the property. So if we're looking at a property that's got a restaurant on it or whatever, are they expanding the use of that property for a restaurant if they build onto it and add more seating? It's like, well, the use is still restaurant. Nothing's changed with the use. But then you can get into it. It's like, well, the scope of the use is bigger because now they've got a bigger menu and they're serving more people. I mean, I don't know. It gets complicated, you know, and I don't think.
Well, use is simpler than that. Use is restaurant, use is fuel station, use is.
You know, that's what it is, yeah.
And so what happens is we have to be careful. See, we do prohibit expansion, and I'm totally fine with that. What I'm not fine with is our lack of definition of expansion, because there are people who want to define expansion of hours as an expansion. Like you can't be open one more hour a day, or you can't go to 24 hours because that would be an expansion of your use. But it's not. I mean,
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying? And those same people would view upgrading critical environmental controls as expansion also. The whole point is that they want to stuff that guy dead. And the problem with that is that it isn't realistic. We have to protect the taxpayers of Albany County from the liability, A, the liability to the groundwater, and B, the liability to our wallets by precluding in the expansion, prohibition of expansion, by precluding or preempting the DEQ's underground storage tank improvements, prepaid improvements program. In other words, we want those things to happen because we don't have any leverage to take away that non-conforming use. If it's going to be there, we want it to be the cleanest and best that it can be. And we also want it, I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, it doesn't. So expansion to me is pretty well covered in non-conforming uses. I don't believe that we had it non-expanded previous to these. I don't believe expansion helps us. It's not in compliance with our zoning regulations. And if we want to put.
I'm not advocating for expansion.
Well,
I'm
that's what I'm talking
advocating for a definition of it. Because there are people who will argue that replacing a leaky fuel line is an expansion, and they do, and they have, right? So we're in a position where if we don't properly define expansion,
Well, I say we could.
like, because repair and replacement, they regard as expansion.
Well,
right.
if we want to do A, instead of a non-conforming use is damaged or would like to be upgraded to best available technology, 1, 2, 3, 4 has to be done, which is already in there.
Right.
So I think expansion adds complexity. I don't like it. I don't think it's in compliance with what we do with non-conforming uses outside of the APOZ. So that's why I want to advocate for it to be removed. And then if we want best control technology added, if we want somebody to do that, then we put it in paragraph A with damaged.
So you're saying to remove the prohibition of expansion.
I'm saying get rid of expansion. You shouldn't be able to expand. Right?
Yeah, you're still
Well, you
permitted.
can't. Expansion is,
Shall be permitted if the applicant can demonstrate. That didn't used to be there.
a reduction of risk to the water quality.
Yeah.
Well, do we allow other non-conforming uses, other places in the county to be expanded if they don't have any negative effects to whatever's around them? Or is expansion
we
on?
don't allow expansion, so. I mean, that's why this gets sticky. I really don't have an opinion either way on this, because this is unique to these.
I'm fine with not, I'm with Pete, I'm fine with not allowing expansion. The problem is we have to make sure that when we don't, if we're gonna eliminate allowing expansion, that we define what expansion is so that people don't, so that nobody tries to take liberty with expansion to say that you can't upgrade your tech. Because that's not good for the aquifer.
Yeah. So if we can put that, David, into A, whatever, moving to best available control technology, which includes a lot of things. Then we take out B, and I think Heber's concern is minimized or eliminated, and my concern over the term expansion is gone too. So, okay. Do you have that?
So what exactly do you want to move into A from the expansion area?
So if a non-conforming use is damaged due to conditions beyond the control of the owner or operator, or the owner and operator would like to, what is the sentence here? Move to the best available control technology, or whatever that term is. Then the owner operator will have to do a description of the damage and or the control technology to be upgraded, a description of the planned repairs and or control technology, documentation, and provide documentation in compliance with state and federal rules and regulations.
And of course, they would do that right in the underground storage tank process. So they would just be forwarding what they do in that process over to us. So
and they would
get
have
a copy.
yes, and they would.
Thanks. I needed to go.
Yeah. Okay.
And that actually somewhat aligns with our regs for non-conforming structures and enlarging or improving.
So that gets rid of all of 5, takes us down to 15C. And then C takes us all the way down to 6, where we can see. Anybody have anything from 1 through 6?
I am curious about, Sue, I'm curious about your statement about a leak. Because the DEQ documents all the leaks and the quantities of them, and the DEQ never documented one there.
They didn't, but it didn't report a suspected leak in the time they should have, and it just happened that a DEQ person was there.
Yeah, but if it was a suspected leak, if it had been one, then they would have documented it and it would be on the DEQ's website. So essentially, you're saying that they didn't do something they didn't have to do.
No,
It didn't, the DEQ didn't rule it to be a spill or a leak. Or it would be shown that, they would say that and detail the nature of it on their website.
I don't remember the whole thing. I believe it was not reported when, the owner did not report.
So the
I suspect it
non-documentable leak wasn't reported in time. In the appropriate time.
I don't remember how that went down. You, Pete?
I don't remember either, but I do have something to add to this. I've done some research on underground storage tanks, and so maybe this is 7. And I don't believe this adds anything to somebody who has an underground storage tank in the APOZ. And I'll forward this information to you. I think the county should be notified immediately in the failure of any release detection component or system to pass annual inspection, failure of a passing result in a monthly tank gauging test, failure to pass tank tightness test, indication from any release detection system, including product inventory control that a release may have occurred, spillage of more than 25 gallons of hazardous material, or whatever that standard is, if it's 25 gallons, receipt of a notification of violation or any citation from any state or federal regulatory agency. Now, I think all of those things are required of underground storage tanks. But I think the county should be copied on those reports. And that's my intent, is so that we're.
And you're gonna forward that to me.
I will forward that to you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I agree. Anything that would be reportable to the DEQ
And then,
could be required to be reported to us too.
yeah, and then on failure to comply with state and federal laws will extinguish a non-conforming use. And I think that that's justified with underground storage tanks, knowing that that's the number one contributor to fouling of water, underground storage tanks.
How many non-conforming uses do we have in the APOZ?
One that we know of.
One that we know of.
Yeah.
So if we don't know of it, somebody would have to prove that use. As a matter of fact, so us knowing of it is part of the proof of that use.
But if we found an underground storage tank somewhere else, right, that we didn't know of, it would be non-conforming for that. And then we would apply these uniform storage tank regulations or reporting requirements to them. And I think that only makes good sense in light of the fact. All right, 15, let's see. Let's go with D here because it seems to be the lead.
Isn't it interesting that there's only one situation that this stuff will ever be applied to? Because there won't ever be any more non-conforming uses.
We shall all say yay, because
That's
you
the
want
intent. Yeah.
conforming to apply with your zoning regulations. That's the intent of it all. And maybe this is where failure to comply with state and federal laws will extinguish a non-conforming use. Would be under D, maybe 5. And I will send that to you also. Anybody else have anything?
Well, what if in the tennis match between industry and, let's say, the EPA or the DEQ?
Yeah.
Sometimes accusations are made and they wind up in litigation. before a determination of failure to comply happens, right? So who certifies the failure to comply? The DEQ or the EPA? You know, how is that determination made? The non-compliance determination with the federal rules? Do we decide
That's a fair point.
when or if they did? Or is it the governing agency on the federal level who would have to make a ruling of non-compliance? To me, I think it would be based on whatever, when the process is exhausted with whatever regulatory agency and the recalcitrant business owner won't comply, there is some way that they state that or document that. And it seems like to me that would be the time that our regs would kick in, because we can't say that somebody hasn't complied with the federal regs until the feds say they haven't, you know, state or federal.
Yeah, I agree with you. And so we'll figure out what industry standard is. I can't imagine we're the first ones to head down this path. So whatever failure of state or federal regulations, whatever that best practice is or whatever that definition is, we'll just insert that in there. And I didn't know enough to know what that is. I didn't do enough research, I guess.
Well, and we wouldn't want to state them, because if we had any errant inclusions or omissions, it would goof us up. We would want the statement, the reference, to be as simple as possible.
Right, and he says these requirements are intended to supplement, not to supersede any other applicable requirements of federal, state, or local law regarding aquifer protection and/or groundwater contamination. So I think this takes us.
But hey, here's a question. What if we change that to do not? So when we say they're not intended, that's just a fun statement. But if we say these requirements do not supplement or supersede, that's a more defined.
Well, for me, this is a statement of local control. These requirements are intended to supplement, but not to supersede, so that we can, it's our water, we can supplement.
What if we just take out are intended to? Intended is a conditional statement. If we want to assert the local piece more, we would take are intended to out.
Or should not supersede any other.
Because then somebody gets to argue whether. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess your statement of intent is only trying to help people to understand your regulations, but if that's a sticking point, your thoughts on that, David, is that helpful for people to understanding? And saying we're trying to help these along, but we're not going to supersede anything that we can't supersede.
I mean, it clears that statement up.
Yeah.
Like, what if it says these requirements supplement and do not supersede other applicable requirements of federal, state, local law regarding yada, 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 right?
Well, hopefully that's true. Maybe they don't supplement, but your thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, I don't care either way, really. I mean, I'm not.
Yeah, I'm not.
Well, are intended to introduces some ambivalence about us asserting our own local authority intentions, right?
Okay, you have any problem?
Somewhat, but as Pete just read, or you just read, these requirements supplement and do not supersede. Well, we would hope they do. So again, the tension is there. You just don't write it.
So
I think
you're
it's
in
a-
favor of not-intended be staying in there?
I don't think
Or
it really
intended?
makes,
Or do you think it makes any difference?
I don't really think it changes anything, to
Okay.
be honest.
No, me either. I'm fine with it. Anything on 9, 10, 11, or 12?
Just one thing, I'd like to move a sentence, and only because I think it gives a little different definition. On 10, second sentence, David, where it says all wells including but not limited and goes on. I'd like to put all wells, comma, which are no longer in use by the owner, comma, including but not limited to, so that you're just moving that statement up, because otherwise it sounds like it's pumping wells and monitoring wells that are no longer in use, and I want to make sure it's all wells.
Sure. It would
Does
read
that make
nicer.
sense?
It would
So
read
just
nicer.
add which are not no longer in use.
Yeah,
All
all
wells
wells which are no longer in use by the owner, and then keeps going, and then where you see that
Including but not
statement
limited.
again, just remove it.
I think I got it.
Isn't that interesting? Like define use. What if somebody samples a well once a year? Is that a use? And it's not used for anything else but monitoring. Or what if it gets sampled every 5 years? What's use?
So commissioners, any final statements? And then I'm going to ask David and Jennifer if they have any questions about the direction. Right, and David, any questions for us?
I don't think
Clarity.
so.
And I owe you an email, and I'll get that to you today. Hopefully as soon as possible. Please know that there is probably a correct way to write the things that I would like to have written. I'll
Okay.
give you the best I could,
Okay.
and then you guys do the work that you do.
Sure.
Jennifer, anything? Okay.
David's really good at writing stuff.
Yeah, he's a pro. Whatnot.
The
Yeah,
law of
gotcha.
unintended consequences, you understand well. Sometimes you say something you don't need to say.
And as I stated before, I'll CC you as well, Jennifer, just where some words I
Okay.
want to change, it's just vocabulary
Absolutely.
and grammar things.
Yeah, so if we can work this up, then we'll probably bring it back to a commission meeting. And then if there's more to be done on it, then we'll figure it out. If not, then we'll send it back out to public comment.
So you had asked at the prior meeting if it had to go back to planning and zoning or not. So I did some research and made an informal call to the AG that we work with regularly. And from my research and what he confirmed is that because that section in 18.5.205, I think it's B, has that specific procedure defined where it has to be certified by planning and zoning to you. And then from there, the commission either votes to accept it or votes to decline it. His thought was if there are substantial and material changes made, then it needs to go back to planning and zoning to be recertified to you before it can go out to public comment without missing that piece in there. Because there's a lot of case law that says that you have to, when you have those specific statutes like that, you have to give those words in that statute meaning. And the concern is that if we don't go back to planning and zoning, it opens it up to where it's not approved the way it should be approved, and then would mitigate the changes that you're making.
Okay, could you just make that a formal request to the AG's office so we can get something in formal writing?
Yes,
Thank you, Jennifer. Not that I don't believe you.
No.
It's just always better to have the record.
Yep, I will. Just know that may take several months to get back.
Okay,
They're not quick,
okay,
but I will. I can write it up and send it in this afternoon
thank you.
and ask them if they could hurry.
Okay, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anything else, commissioners? Thank you guys for your willingness to participate with us on a Monday morning and for working so expeditiously through this. And yes, we'll not see you the rest of the week, hopefully. Right? So, get out of your hair and let you do the work that you're supposed to do.
It'll take longer. To get an answer.
Pete, let me know when you're ready for the recording to stop.
I'm ready for the recording to stop. Do you want me to do that, Adam?
Yeah, give it a try.
Okay.
Oh, there's an N down there in the bottom right.
Yeah,
Nice, pretty red.
oh, there we are. Yes. How'd that go? Adam, did I do
Perfect. Yep, and then just go ahead and go leave and end meeting for all, and the streaming services will conclude at that point, and I will wrap up the recording and get that put out where it needs to go.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us on this work session on a snowy Monday morning. Have a great rest